Hello, welcome back to Auntie Anna's Storytime. I found this book on my shelf that we had bought here in Hong Kong. Actually, I think this one was a gift from a friend. There was a lady, Sarah Brennan, and Harry Harrison, who did the illustrations, who wrote a set of books about each animal in the Chinese zodiac. And this one is The Year of the Dragon. It's called The Tale of Chester Choi. They're just fun little rhyming stories. There was a Chinese dragon. His name was Chester Choi. When Chester Choi grew hungry, he'd eat a little boy. Though sometimes in the evening, when all was dark and quiet, he'd eat a little girl instead to brighten up his diet. Now parents hated Chester. They didn't understand that dragons must eat dinner too, with tasty kids to hand. They thought that he was evil and tried to find his lair, but Chester, being magical, was neither here nor there. So Chester Choi grew fatter, and little kids grew few. The townsfolk lived in constant fear the beast would strike anew. They hid their children nightly in cupboards, drawers, and vats, or rolled them up in carpets, or covered them in mats. Yet always Chester found them, no matter where they hid. He'd shove them in a cookie jar and quickly slam the lid. Then silently, on tiptoe, he'd creep outside the door, then tuck the jar beneath his arm, and off away he'd soar. He'd take them to a magic cave, invisible and deep, high up in a misty mountainside, as sheer as it was steep. And there he'd take the lid off, he'd tip the children out, then sprinkle them with oyster sauce, and pop them in his mouth. One cold and windy evening, as Chester ventured out, he felt a tiny prickling of loneliness and doubt. The children that he gobbled, while tasty none the less, appeared to be more fun alive than dead, he must confess. He'd seen them in their playrooms, engrossed with all their toys, their faces lit with laughter, their laughter filled with joy. He'd watched them hug their playmates whenever they were sad, the hugs that Chester never knew when he was a lad. He thought about his childhood with neither mum nor dad, nor any other dragons, to grin when he was glad. He thought about his magic cave, so empty, dark, and bare, the sort of home you live in when there's no one else to care. And suddenly a teardrop came rolling down his face. It rattled down his scaly cheek and started gaining pace. It wobbled for a moment, then slipped beneath his jaw, and, with a noisy splatter, went dashing to the floor. The dragon was astounded. He hadn't cried for years. He heaved a mighty dragon sob and then collapsed in tears. They formed a salty torrent which ran down to the sea and swept away the towns where Chester hunted for his tea. Such rotten luck for Chester, so lonely, so forlorn, and now, thanks to a teardrop, his dinners were all gone. It really was unreasonable. It wasn't fair nor right. He set his jaw with grim resolve. His luck would change tonight. Next time he stole a jar full of little girls or boys, he'd give them heaps of cuddles and lots of lovely toys. Delicious drinks they'd guzzle, on yummy food they'd sup. They'd laugh and play for hours and hours, and then he'd eat them up. Now far beneath the mountain, beside the rolling sea, there lived a little urchin whose name was Jimmy Lee. Poor Jimmy was an orphan. His mom and dad were dead, and no one cared for Jimmy, so he cared for him instead. He woke himself each morning, he made himself his bed, he fed himself his breakfast, he locked his little shed, then came out along the seashore, come sleet or hail or shine, young Jimmy would go fishing with his trusty rod and line. Young Jim caught sharks for dinner, and lobsters by the pail. He tied an octopus in knots and wrestled with a whale. He'd surfed down giant tsunamis on the vast South China Sea. So there down by the seashore lived Jimmy Lee the brave, and there up on the mountain lived Chester in his cave. One tiny, tough, and fearless, one hungry, sad, and vexed. I wonder if my readers can guess what happened next. I skipped this part. Then battled wicked pirates on his way back home for tea. It was a stormy evening. The wind blew wet and wild. The lightning flashed as Chester Choi went hunting for a child. He plied the hills and valleys in search of busy town, but not a house was standing where the flood had thundered down. He flew along the coastline, he searched the rocky bay, he flapped across the beaches where the children used to play. But all was dark and empty, with not a child in view, and as the thunder rumbled, Chester's tummy rumbled too. But just as day was dawning, and Chester turned for bed, he flew around a corner and spotted Jimmy's shed. He tiptoed to the window and took a glance around. Jim didn't know what hit him when the cookie jar came down. When Jimmy woke the next morning inside the magic cave, his captor grinned in welcome. He waved a cheery wave, then stuffed him full of egg tarts, dim sum, and lemon tea, and lots of grown-up goodies that kids never get to see. They played with Chinese checkers, fought aliens from Mars. They raced around on roller blades, pretending they were cars. They kicked around a football, played hockey, darts, and dice. They'd neither of them had such fun, nor had a friend so nice. Then Chester's tummy grumbled. His eyes grew mean. He crept on tiptoe to the cupboard where the oyster sauce was kept. Young Jim played in the corner. He didn't have a clue what Chester Choi was planning, or so Chester thought. Do you? Jim grabbed a fluffy feather. He prickled Chester's nose. He poked at Chester's tummy. He jiggled Chester's toes. He tickled Chester's armpits and underneath his chin. Poor Chester couldn't help it. He simply had to grin. The grin grew to a giggle, the giggle to a laugh, the laughter to a loud guffaw which doubled him in half. His legs and arms went wobbly, his claws went skittering past. Jim quickly cast his fishing line, and Chester Choi was trussed. Now what do mighty dragons, unused to being beat, do when kids like Jimmy Lee tie up their hands and feet? Snort fiery flames in anger, blow clouds of smoke and hide? That's not what Chester Choi did. He huddled up and cried, I'm sorry I ate children. I'm sorry I was bad. I'm sorry I scared mums and dads and made them cross and sad. I wish the kids I've eaten could be alive again. But most of all, I really wish I had a proper friend. Young Jimmy was the kind child. He saw the tears were true. He firmly told the dragon, Here's what we're going to do. You're going to sit and wait here. I'm going to go to sea. But I'll be back this evening with something for your tea. And sure enough, that evening, young Lee came back, heaving a massive snapper in a tattered Hessian sack. He brought a little cooker, a steamer, pan and wok, and ginger, rice, and scallions stuffed in a purple sock. The dragon watched in silence as Jimmy washed and sliced, and scaled and cleaned and gutted, and chopped and peeled and diced. The steamer was all ready. On to the wok it went, and Chester sighed in rapture when he smelt the wondrous scent. That night a mighty dragon was fed a humble fish. He'd never known such flavors could come out of a dish. He made a vow to Jimmy. I'll never, ever eat a little boy or girl again, not even for a treat. So Jimmy Lee untied him. They hugged and kissed with glee, and Chester left his gloomy cave to live with Jimmy Lee. And there they stayed together forever and a day, and towns were built, the people smiled, and kids came out to play. And that's the end. There are a lot of books in a lot of different cultures about dragons. You can look those up. Middle Ages, the stories of the knights who fought against the dragons. So a lot of different cultures have dragons at the center of some of their stories.